What if the biggest lie inside BTS wasn't hidden by the members, but by Taehyung himself? Jimmy Fallon leaned forward with a playful smile and looked straight at Jimin and Jungkook. So, is there something you've been hiding from each other, or from everyone watching tonight? The audience laughed, expecting another harmless joke. But before anyone could breathe, Jimin suddenly turned toward Jungkook, gently held his face, and kissed him in front of the entire studio. Every camera froze on the shocking moment. The audience screamed. Jimmy Fallon's smile disappeared instantly. Jungkook stood completely still, unable to believe what had just happened. Then everyone heard the sound of a chair being pushed back. Taehyung was already standing. His eyes burned with anger as he stared directly at Jimin. "You really chose tonight? After everything I sacrificed for both of you?" The studio fell into complete silence. RM looked down. Jin covered his mouth. J-Hope couldn't say a single word. Suga slowly lowered his head, already shaking before Taehyung could even continue. Jimmy Fallon immediately realized something had gone terribly wrong. "Wait, what are you talking about?" Taehyung took one slow step forward and answered with a voice that made everyone uncomfortable. "Because the truth you've all been celebrating tonight was built on the biggest secret we've buried for years." Nobody watching that broadcast understood why Jimmy Fallon suddenly looked terrified, why the producers stopped smiling behind the cameras, or why Suga couldn't stop crying before Taehyung even revealed a single detail. What happened on that stage was never supposed to reach the public, and what you're about to hear is the forgotten version of that night, a story that remained hidden long after the lights went out. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because we'd love to know which country is joining today's story. And if you enjoy emotional BTS drama stories filled with shocking twists and hidden secrets, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this channel so you won't miss the next episode. Now get ready, because the kiss everyone remembers was never the real beginning. It was only the trigger that forced Taehyung to confess the one truth capable of destroying Jimin, Jungkook, Suga, and everyone standing on that stage forever. The applause that had filled the studio only seconds earlier disappeared so completely that even the cameras seemed afraid to move. Every face in the audience carried the same expression of confusion. Nobody knew whether what had just happened was part of the show or something that had escaped everyone's control. Jimmy Fallon looked from Jimin to Jungkook, then toward Taehyung, realizing the atmosphere had changed beyond anything a television host could recover with a joke. Jimin slowly lowered his hand after the unexpected kiss, but he never looked away from Jungkook. His breathing was uneven, yet his expression remained strangely calm, almost as if he had already accepted whatever consequences were about to follow. Jungkook stood frozen, his mind racing through questions he could not answer. He had expected difficult interviews before, awkward rumors, even uncomfortable games prepared by the production team, but never this. Never in front of thousands of people inside the studio and millions watching around the world. "Jimin," Jungkook whispered, barely loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. Before Jimin could respond, Taehyung's voice cut through the silence. "Don't ask him why he did it. Ask yourself why he waited until tonight." The sentence landed like a weight across the stage. RM quietly stepped closer, hoping to calm the situation before it spiraled further, but one glance at Taehyung's face convinced him to stop. He had seen Taehyung angry before, but never like this. This was not anger born from embarrassment. This was anger that had been growing quietly for years. Jimmy Fallon forced a nervous smile, trying to regain control of the live broadcast. "Maybe we should all take a deep breath," he began, but Taehyung interrupted him without raising his voice. "If we stop now, everyone goes home believing another beautiful lie." Even the production crew behind the cameras exchanged worried looks. The floor manager quietly reached for his headset, while another producer signaled for a possible commercial break. Suga remained seated with his head lowered. His hands trembled so badly that Jin instinctively reached over and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Suga did not respond. Instead, a tear fell silently onto the stage floor. J-Hope noticed it immediately. "Hyung," he whispered with growing concern. Suga simply closed his eyes. JIMIN finally turned away from JUNGKOOK and faced Taehyung. "You promised," he said quietly. "I did," Taehyung replied, "until you broke that promise first." Another wave of silence swept through the studio. JUNGKOOK looked between them, realizing this conversation had begun long before tonight. Whatever they were talking about, he had never been told the whole story. "Someone needs to explain what's happening," Jimmy Fallon said more seriously now, "because nobody understands." Taehyung nodded once. "Exactly. Nobody understands because we've spent years making sure they never would." Jimin's jaw tightened. "This isn't the place." "Then tell me," Taehyung answered, taking another step forward. "When was the right place? When everyone was pretending to smile? When someone cried alone? Or when one person carried the blame for all of us?" RM finally spoke. "Taehyung, think carefully." "I've been thinking carefully for years." His reply came instantly. JUNGKOOK's heartbeat grew louder in his own ears. Every sentence hinted at memories he somehow did not share. He looked at Suga again, searching for answers, but Suga refused to lift his head. Instead, his shoulders shook as though he were fighting to stay composed. JIMIN noticed it too, and for the first time since the kiss, confidence disappeared from his face. "Don't bring him into this," JIMIN pleaded. Taehyung's expression softened for only a brief second before hardening again. "I never wanted to. But he has carried this burden longer than anyone else." Jimmy Fallon glanced toward the producers, silently asking whether they should stop filming. Yet nobody moved. Somehow everyone sensed that interrupting now would only make things worse. The audience remained completely still, unable to look away. What had started as another entertaining celebrity interview had transformed into something painfully personal. JUNGKOOK finally found his voice. "If there's something I should know, tell me." Taehyung looked directly into JUNGKOOK's eyes. "Are you sure you're ready to hear why Suga can't even look at you tonight?" JUNGKOOK hesitated. Every instinct told him the answer would change everything. Suga suddenly stood up so quickly that his chair slid backward across the floor. Tears streamed openly down his face as he shook his head. "Please," he whispered. "Not here." The desperation in his voice stunned everyone. JIMIN immediately stepped toward him, but Suga took one step back instead. That single movement hurt JIMIN more than any accusation could have. Taehyung closed his eyes briefly before speaking again. "You see, this is exactly why the truth survived for so long. Because every one of us thought protecting each other meant protecting the secret." JUNGKOOK felt the room becoming smaller with every passing second. He realized the kiss had never been the real shock of the night. It had only unlocked a door that none of them could close again, and standing behind that door was a confession capable of changing the way they remembered every year they had spent together. JUNGKOOK could no longer hear the audience. The lights above the stage blurred into a haze as every word Taehyung had spoken echoed inside his head. He searched each member's face, hoping someone would deny everything, laugh awkwardly, or admit this had become an elaborate prank gone too far. Instead, he found only silence. RM stood with his arms crossed tightly, his expression carrying the weight of someone who had protected the same secret for far too long. Jin stared at the floor as though he already knew how painful the next few minutes would become. J-Hope repeatedly glanced between Suga and JIMIN, desperately wishing one of them would stop Taehyung before it was too late. Jimmy Fallon quietly removed the cue card from his hands and placed it on the table. For the first time in years of hosting unpredictable celebrity interviews, he abandoned the script completely. "I'm not asking as a host anymore," Jimmy said softly. "I'm asking as someone standing here with all of you. If someone is hurting this much, maybe it's time the truth comes out." The sentence lingered in the air. Suga slowly wiped his tears, but new ones immediately replaced them. "Some truths don't heal people," he whispered. "Some truths only create more victims." Jimin looked at him with visible guilt. "Hyung." Suga shook his head before Jimin could continue. "Don't apologize again." That single word, "again," caught JUNGKOOK's attention immediately. Again? How many times had Jimin apologized? How many conversations had happened behind closed doors while he believed everything between the members had been normal? His chest tightened as dozens of forgotten moments suddenly returned to him. Late-night conversations that stopped whenever he entered the room. Long meetings where RM would quietly change the subject. Taehyung disappearing for hours after schedules without explaining where he had gone. Suga sitting alone in recording studios long after everyone else had left. At the time, JUNGKOOK had dismissed them as ordinary moments in a busy career. Now every memory felt different. Every memory seemed connected by something invisible. "Tell me one thing," JUNGKOOK said, his voice calm despite the storm inside him. "Was everyone lying to me?" Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself became the answer. JUNGKOOK slowly looked toward Jimin. Their eyes met for only a second before Jimin lowered his gaze. That hurt more than anything Taehyung had said. Jimin had always been the one JUNGKOOK trusted most when life became overwhelming. If even Jimin had hidden something this important, what else had never been real? Taehyung exhaled slowly. "Nobody wanted to lie to you." JUNGKOOK laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Then what do you call years of silence?" Taehyung opened his mouth to answer, but Suga stepped forward first. His face was pale, his eyes red from crying, yet his voice remained steady. "I call it survival." Every person on stage turned toward him. Even Taehyung looked surprised. Suga rarely interrupted emotional confrontations, especially ones involving Jimin and JUNGKOOK. "You think keeping quiet was easy?" Suga continued. "Every birthday, every concert, every celebration, I remembered that night." JUNGKOOK frowned. "What night?" Suga closed his eyes. The question clearly hurt. Before he could answer, RM quietly stepped beside him. "You don't have to do this alone." Suga nodded gratefully, but his expression remained broken. Jimmy Fallon noticed that the audience had become completely motionless. Nobody reached for their phones. Nobody whispered. It felt less like a television show and more like witnessing a family falling apart in real time. The producers signaled again for a commercial break, but Jimmy ignored them. Something told him the world deserved to hear this story, exactly as it unfolded, without interruption. Jimin suddenly took a step toward Taehyung. "If you're going to reveal everything," he said quietly, "don't twist it because you're angry." Taehyung looked back at him with disappointment rather than rage. "I'm angry because I defended you." Jimin froze. Taehyung continued. "For years, every rumor, every accusation, every misunderstanding, I stood in front of all of it because I believed protecting you was the right thing." His voice cracked for the first time. "But tonight you kissed JUNGKOOK without asking yourself what that would do to everyone who sacrificed everything to keep the past buried." JUNGKOOK stared at Taehyung in disbelief. "You sacrificed something for us?" Taehyung smiled bitterly. "Not just me." He slowly turned toward Suga. He sacrificed the most. Suga immediately covered his face with both hands. His shoulders trembled uncontrollably. Jin embraced him without saying a word, but even that couldn't stop the tears. J-Hope quietly wiped his own eyes, unable to watch his friend break down any longer. Jimin looked as though he wanted to speak, yet every sentence died before reaching his lips. The guilt written across his face became impossible to hide. Jungkook's breathing grew heavier. "Someone please stop speaking in riddles." His voice echoed across the silent studio. "Tell me what happened." Taehyung slowly nodded. "Then answer one question first." Jungkook waited. "Do you remember the night you disappeared after rehearsal? The night everyone told you nothing important had happened?" Jungkook searched his memory. A faint image surfaced. Rain, an empty hallway, a missed phone call from JIMIN. Suga sitting alone outside the practice room the next morning with exhausted eyes. He had never questioned it because everyone insisted everything was fine. His heart suddenly began pounding harder than before. "I remember," he answered quietly. Taehyung lowered his head before meeting Jungkook's eyes one last time. "Good," he said, "because that wasn't the night you lost your memories. It was the night the rest of us agreed to lose the truth." The moment Taehyung finished speaking, the silence inside the studio became almost unbearable. Jungkook felt as if every memory he had trusted for years had suddenly cracked beneath his feet. He replayed that rainy night over and over in his mind, but every image ended the same way, with blurred conversations, worried faces, and everyone insisting that nothing unusual had happened. Back then, he had believed them without hesitation. They were his family. There had never been a reason to doubt their words, but now every reassurance sounded less like comfort and more like carefully rehearsed protection. Jimmy Fallon slowly leaned back in his chair, unable to hide his concern anymore. He had interviewed world leaders, Hollywood legends, and global superstars, yet he had never witnessed an interview transform into something this painfully personal. Nobody behind the cameras dared interrupt. Even the producers had stopped signaling for a commercial break, realizing that whatever was unfolding had already moved far beyond television. RM took a slow breath before speaking. "Jungkook, if you remember anything from that night, tell us exactly what you remember." Jungkook closed his eyes. Fragments surfaced one after another. The exhausting rehearsal. JIMIN smiling before receiving a phone call that immediately changed his expression. Taehyung leaving the practice room without saying goodbye. Suga remaining behind to finish working on music alone. Rain pouring outside the building. Then darkness. "I remember walking outside," Jungkook whispered. "I remember hearing someone arguing, but I couldn't recognize the voices." Nobody interrupted him. "Then I remember waking up the next morning. Everyone looked tired. JIMIN kept asking if I was okay. RM told me I had simply overworked myself. Jin made breakfast. Hobie joked around to make the atmosphere lighter. Taehyung barely spoke. Suga never looked at me once." As Jungkook finished, Suga's tears returned. He slowly turned away, unable to face him any longer. JIMIN instinctively reached toward Suga again, but Suga quietly stepped aside before JIMIN could touch his shoulder. The rejection struck JIMIN harder than any accusation. Jimmy Fallon noticed the pain passing between them without a single loud argument. It was the kind of guilt that had existed for so long it no longer needed words. Taehyung finally broke the silence. "Do you know why Suga couldn't look at you the next morning?" Jungkook slowly shook his head. "Because he blamed himself." Jungkook frowned. "For what?" Taehyung answered without hesitation. "For choosing the wrong person." The sentence echoed across the stage. Confusion spread through the audience. Even Jimmy Fallon looked completely lost. Jungkook stared at Taehyung, waiting for an explanation that never came. Instead, Taehyung looked toward Suga once again. "Tell him." Suga remained silent. "Please," Taehyung repeated, this time more gently. Suga slowly lowered his hands from his face. His eyes were swollen from crying, but there was something else inside them now. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of carrying a secret that had become heavier with every passing year. That night, Suga began, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Someone forced me to make a decision." Everyone listened without moving. There wasn't enough time to save everything. His breathing became uneven. "I believed I could only protect one future." JUNGKOOK's heartbeat accelerated. "What does that mean?" Suga looked directly at him for the first time that night. "It means I thought sacrificing one person's happiness would protect everyone else." JIMIN immediately closed his eyes. His expression confirmed that he already knew every word Suga was about to say. RM silently clenched his fists. Jin looked away. J-Hope swallowed hard, unable to hide his emotions anymore. Jimmy Fallon noticed every reaction. Each member carried the same burden, but each expressed it differently. Taehyung's anger, Jimin's guilt, RM's responsibility, Jin's quiet sorrow, Hobie's helplessness, Suga's regret. Only JUNGKOOK remained completely unaware of the truth that had shaped all of their lives. "Who was sacrificed?" JUNGKOOK finally asked. Nobody answered immediately. "Oh," Taehyung looked toward Jimin. "Tell him yourself." Jimin stood motionless. His lips parted, but no words came out. The silence stretched so long that even the audience seemed afraid to breathe. Finally, Jimin whispered, "It was supposed to be me." JUNGKOOK's eyes widened. "What?" Jimin looked at the floor. "Everything that happened afterward, every decision I made, every time I pushed you away, every smile I forced, started because of that night." JUNGKOOK felt his entire body tense. None of this made sense anymore. The kiss that had shocked millions of viewers now felt insignificant compared to the invisible history hidden beneath it. Taehyung folded his arms, but the anger on his face slowly gave way to sadness. Why Jimin sometimes disappeared emotionally, even when everyone else was celebrating. JUNGKOOK nodded without realizing it. "You thought he was just tired." Another pause followed. "He wasn't tired." Taehyung's voice became almost a whisper. "He was living with a promise that should never have been made." Suga immediately covered his mouth as another wave of emotion overwhelmed him. Jimin looked toward JUNGKOOK with eyes full of regret, knowing that once the next piece of the truth was spoken aloud, there would be no way for any of them to return to the version of their lives they had spent years pretending was real. Jimin remained completely still after admitting that everything had been supposed to be him. The confession echoed through the silent studio, leaving JUNGKOOK unable to decide whether he should demand answers or simply walk away before hearing something that could never be forgotten. His breathing became slower, but only because he was forcing himself to stay calm. Inside, every emotion was colliding at once. Confusion, fear, betrayal, regret. None of them made sense yet, but all of them felt painfully real. Jimmy Fallon looked around the stage and realized something extraordinary. Every member seemed to know the ending of this story, except the one person standing at its center. "Jimin," Jimmy said carefully, abandoning any role as a television host, "if this has been hurting all of you for years, maybe the only way forward is to tell it honestly." Jimin slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red, but there were no tears. He looked like someone who had cried so many times in private that there were no tears left to give. "Honesty doesn't always save people," he answered quietly. "Sometimes it only tells them exactly when everything started falling apart." JUNGKOOK stepped closer until only a short distance separated them. "Then, tell me when it started." Jimin opened his mouth, but before he could answer, RM gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "If we're doing this," RM said, "nobody tells the story alone." Jimin nodded. "You're right." He turned toward the other members. "Because every one of us made a choice that night." Jin finally spoke after remaining silent for so long. "And every one of us believed we were doing the right thing." His calm voice somehow made the atmosphere even heavier. J-Hope looked at Jungkook with visible sadness. If we had known what those choices would do years later, none of us would have agreed. Jungkook looked from one member to another, realizing that this secret had never belonged to one person. It belonged to all of them. Every smile they had shared since then suddenly felt connected to something hidden underneath. Every celebration had carried invisible guilt. Every success had been built while one unanswered question remained buried. Suga slowly inhaled, wiping away the last traces of tears from his face. His hands were still trembling, but his voice had become steadier. "I've spent years wishing tonight would never happen," he admitted. "Not because I was afraid of the truth, but because I was afraid of losing all of you once the truth was finally spoken." Taehyung looked at him with sympathy. The anger that had exploded earlier was no longer directed at Suga. It had never been. It was directed at the silence that had trapped them all. "We're already losing each other," Taehyung said softly. "Keeping quiet isn't protecting anyone anymore." Those words struck everyone differently. RM slowly lowered his head. Jin closed his eyes. Hobie quietly nodded. Even Jimin could no longer argue. Deep inside, he knew Taehyung was right. The secret had stopped protecting them years ago. Now it was only destroying them one conversation at a time. Jungkook's voice broke the silence again. "There's one thing I don't understand." Everyone looked at him. "If all of this started because of me, why didn't anyone trust me enough to decide for myself?" No one answered immediately. The question hurt because it exposed the flaw in every decision they had made. They had protected Jungkook without ever giving him the chance to choose whether he wanted that protection. RM finally answered, "Because you were the youngest. Because we thought carrying the pain ourselves would be easier than letting you carry it too." Jungkook shook his head slowly. "But you didn't carry it." His eyes drifted toward Suga. "He did." Suga lowered his gaze again, unable to deny it. Years of guilt were written across his exhausted face. Jimin stepped closer to him once more. This time, Suga didn't move away. Instead, he quietly whispered, "I'm tired, Jimin." Those 3 words were enough to shatter the last wall Jimin had been holding together. He looked away as emotion overwhelmed him, knowing that Suga was no longer talking about tonight. He was talking about every single day since that forgotten rainy evening. Jimmy Fallon glanced toward the audience. Many people were wiping away tears without fully understanding the hidden story. They didn't need every detail to recognize genuine heartbreak. The emotions on stage were impossible to fake. Taehyung took one slow breath before speaking again. "Jungkook." Jungkook looked at him. "Everything we've said tonight is only the beginning." Jungkook's expression hardened. "Then stop protecting me and tell me everything." Taehyung nodded, but before answering, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Every member immediately noticed the movement. RM's eyes widened. Jin took an involuntary step forward. Hobie whispered Suga's name under his breath. Jimin's face turned completely pale. Even Suga looked up in shock for the first time since the confrontation had begun. Taehyung slowly pulled out an old, slightly worn white envelope with folded edges, holding it carefully as though it were the most dangerous object in the room. Jungkook frowned, unable to recognize it, but everyone else clearly did. Jimin instinctively reached out. "No," he whispered. "Please don't show him that." Taehyung looked down at the envelope for a long moment before raising his eyes to meet Jungkook's. "You asked when everything began," he said quietly. "It began with the words inside this letter. A letter that was never meant for you to read, but one that every one of us has been living under ever since." No one moved after the old white envelope appeared in Taehyung's hand. It was surprisingly ordinary, its corners worn from years of being folded and unfolded, yet every member reacted as though they had just seen something far more dangerous. JUNGKOOK immediately noticed the fear spreading across their faces. RM's shoulders became tense. Jin quietly closed his eyes. J-Hope took an unconscious step backward. JIMIN looked ready to collapse where he stood, while Suga stared at the envelope with an expression that mixed regret, grief, and quiet surrender. Jimmy Fallon had no idea what the envelope contained, but he understood one thing immediately. It wasn't simply a letter. It was evidence of a promise that had controlled their lives for years. "What is it?" Jimmy asked carefully. Taehyung did not answer him. His eyes never left JUNGKOOK. "Do you recognize it?" he asked instead. JUNGKOOK slowly shook his head. "I've never seen it before." Taehyung gave a faint, bitter smile. "Exactly. You were never supposed to." JIMIN suddenly stepped forward, his voice more desperate than at any moment since the interview began. "Please, Taehyung, don't make him read it here." "Why?" Taehyung replied calmly. "Because you're afraid he'll finally understand why you kept running away every time he got too close?" JIMIN froze. JUNGKOOK's heart skipped a beat. Running away. Hoyo, the words immediately awakened dozens of forgotten memories. There had been so many moments over the years when JIMIN had suddenly become distant without explanation. Nights when he ignored calls, conversations he ended halfway through, smiles that disappeared the instant JUNGKOOK asked if something was wrong. At the time, JUNGKOOK had blamed himself, believing he had somehow said the wrong thing. Now, those memories no longer felt random. They felt planned. Suga quietly spoke without lifting his head. He wasn't running away from JUNGKOOK. Everyone turned toward him. He was running away from the promise. The studio fell silent again. Jimmy Fallon slowly leaned forward. "What promise?" Suga closed his eyes. "The first rule." JUNGKOOK frowned. "Rule?" Taehyung nodded slowly. "There were rules." The sentence confused everyone listening. "After that night," Taehyung continued, "we believed there was only one way to stop everything from falling apart." RM quietly interrupted. "We didn't create those rules because we wanted control." His voice sounded exhausted. "We created them because we were terrified." JUNGKOOK looked directly at RM. "Terrified of what?" RM answered honestly. "Losing you." JUNGKOOK's confusion deepened instead of fading. How was pushing me away supposed to protect me? Nobody answered immediately because none of them had ever found a satisfying answer themselves. They had simply lived by those rules for so long that questioning them became impossible. Taehyung carefully held up the envelope. "The rules are written in here." JIMIN immediately whispered, "Don't." Taehyung looked at him with visible disappointment. "He deserves to know." Suga nodded weakly. He always did. Those words broke something inside JIMIN. He slowly lowered his head, accepting that there was no longer any way to stop the truth from surfacing. JUNGKOOK took another step forward. "Open it." Taehyung hesitated for the first time. He had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it had finally arrived, even he understood there would be no turning back. Carefully, he unfolded the aged envelope and removed several neatly folded sheets of paper. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained perfectly clear. Jimmy Fallon noticed that Taehyung's hands were shaking. Even the person revealing the truth seemed afraid of it. Taehyung unfolded the first page but did not begin reading immediately. Instead, he looked at every member one last time. "If I read this," he said quietly, "everything changes." RM nodded once. Jin silently agreed. J-Hope closed his eyes. Suga whispered, "It already has." Jimin remained motionless. Finally, Taehyung looked back at JUNGKOOK. "The first sentence says, His voice stopped. He swallowed hard before continuing. From this day forward, no matter what happens, JUNGKOOK must never learn what really happened that night. JUNGKOOK felt the blood drain from his face. Hearing his own name written into a secret document was far more disturbing than he had imagined. Taehyung continued reading. If protecting him requires distance, choose distance. If protecting him requires silence, choose silence. If protecting him requires sacrifice, choose sacrifice. No exceptions. Jimmy Fallon stared in disbelief. Who wrote that? The question echoed across the stage. Every member looked toward the same person at exactly the same time. Slowly, almost reluctantly, RM answered in a quiet voice. I did. JUNGKOOK immediately turned toward him. You? RM nodded without trying to defend himself. I wrote the rules. JUNGKOOK's breathing became uneven. Then tell me why. RM looked directly into JUNGKOOK's eyes, and for the first time that night there was no leader standing before him, no confident spokesperson, no calm protector, only a man carrying years of unbearable guilt. Because, RM whispered, the person we were truly trying to protect wasn't you alone. The final sentence hung over the stage like a storm that refused to break. JUNGKOOK stared at RM, unable to process what he had just heard. For years, he had believed every decision the leader made was carefully measured for the good of the group. Yet now, RM was admitting that the rules controlling their lives had been built around someone else as well. If those rules weren't only for me, JUNGKOOK asked slowly, then who were they really protecting? RM closed his eyes for several seconds before answering. Someone who believed losing himself was a fair price if everyone else could keep smiling. JUNGKOOK instinctively turned toward JIMIN, convinced the answer pointed to him, but RM gently shook his head. No. The single word surprised everyone. Even Taehyung looked confused. Not JIMIN? Jimmy Fallon asked quietly. RM looked toward the far end of the stage where Suga stood motionless. Suga immediately understood. Don't, he whispered. RM's voice became softer. It's already too late to stop. Suga slowly looked away, knowing the truth had finally reached the point where it could no longer be contained. JUNGKOOK followed RM's gaze until his eyes settled on Suga. Hyung, he asked cautiously. Suga did not answer. Instead, he let out a long breath that sounded almost defeated. Jin stepped beside him, offering silent support, but Suga barely seemed to notice. The rules weren't created to protect only JUNGKOOK, RM finally admitted. They were also created to stop Suga from destroying himself. Jimmy Fallon frowned. Destroying himself, RM nodded. After that night, he blamed himself for everything. Suga quietly laughed, but the sound carried no happiness. Because it was my fault? JIMIN immediately interrupted. No. His reply came without hesitation. It wasn't. Suga looked directly at him. You still can't say that after everything that happened. JIMIN's expression cracked. I've been saying it for years. Only when nobody else could hear. The words struck JIMIN like a physical blow. JUNGKOOK watched them, realizing their conversations had continued in private, while he remained completely unaware. How many late nights had they spent trying to convince each other to keep carrying this invisible burden? How many apologies had been exchanged behind closed doors while he believed everyone was simply busy with work? Taehyung slowly lowered the pages of the letter. The second rule, he said quietly, was written because of Suga. He looked down and read aloud. No member is allowed to tell Suga that what happened was his fault, even if he refuses to believe otherwise. Jimmy Fallon blinked in disbelief. You wrote a rule telling people not to blame him? RM nodded, because blaming himself became the only thing he believed. Suga smiled faintly, but sadness filled every part of it. It didn't work. RM looked at him with visible pain. I know. Suga slowly rubbed his eyes before speaking again. Every morning I woke up thinking maybe today would be easier. He laughed quietly. It never was. The audience remained silent, completely absorbed in the confession unfolding before them. Even those who did not know the hidden story could recognize years of accumulated regret. JUNGKOOK stepped toward Suga until only a few feet separated them. Why? He asked gently. Why did you think any of this was your fault? Suga hesitated. His lips parted several times before any sound emerged. Because... He stopped again. Taehyung looked at him with concern. You don't have to say everything at once. Suga slowly shook his head. No, I've hidden long enough. He inhaled deeply. That night, someone asked me to choose between telling you the truth or protecting the future of all 7 of us. JUNGKOOK's heart pounded harder. Who asked you? Suga remained silent. RM lowered his head. Jin looked away. J-Hope pressed his lips together. JIMIN quietly closed his eyes. Their reactions answered the question before words ever could. JUNGKOOK slowly whispered, One of us? Nobody denied it. Fallon looked around the stage in disbelief. You're saying the decision came from inside the group? RM answered carefully. Not because anyone wanted power. Then why? Jimmy asked. RM's voice almost disappeared. Because fear makes people believe impossible choices are the only choices left. Taehyung unfolded another page from the envelope. There's something else JUNGKOOK deserves to hear. JIMIN looked up immediately. Please. Taehyung met his eyes. This part isn't about blaming you. JIMIN remained silent. Taehyung began reading. If JIMIN ever decides to tell JUNGKOOK the truth, the rest of the members must stop him, even if it breaks his heart. JUNGKOOK's eyes widened. Slowly he turned toward JIMIN. You tried to tell me? JIMIN's breathing became uneven. More than once. When? JUNGKOOK asked. JIMIN looked at the floor. Every time I asked you if you had time to talk, every time I suddenly changed the subject, every time I walked away. His voice cracked. I wasn't changing my mind. He looked back at JUNGKOOK with overwhelming guilt. Someone always reminded me of the rules before I could say the first sentence. JUNGKOOK felt as though years of misunderstanding were collapsing all at once. He had spent so long believing JIMIN was simply becoming distant, never realizing those moments had been silent battles between loyalty and honesty. Before he could ask another question, Taehyung slowly unfolded the final page of the letter. Unlike the others, this page contained only a single handwritten sentence at the bottom, written in darker ink than the rest. Taehyung stared at it for several seconds before looking toward RM. RM's face immediately lost all color. He knew exactly which sentence Taehyung had reached, because it was the one line he had prayed JUNGKOOK would never hear aloud. Taehyung held the final page without speaking. His fingers tightened around the paper, as though even reading the last sentence aloud would make the burden heavier than it already was. Across the stage, every member understood exactly what was written there. RM slowly removed his glasses and lowered his head. Jin closed his eyes, taking a long, unsteady breath. J-Hope quietly clasped his hands together, silently hoping someone would stop what was about to happen. Suga's face had become completely expressionless, the kind of expression that only appeared after years of crying had left no tears behind. JIMIN stared at the floor, unable to look at either Taehyung or JUNGKOOK. Fallon noticed the dramatic shift immediately. Until now, every page of the letter had revealed painful decisions and impossible promises, But whatever remained on the last page clearly frightened all of them even more. "Taehyung," Jimmy said gently, "what's written there?" Taehyung looked down again but did not answer. Instead, he slowly folded the page halfway, almost as if his body was refusing to continue. JUNGKOOK stepped closer. "Read it." Taehyung met his eyes. "Once you hear this, you'll never be able to see us the same way again." JUNGKOOK's answer came without hesitation. "I already can't." Those words echoed across the silent studio. Taehyung nodded once. He unfolded the paper completely and began reading in a calm voice that somehow made every word even more painful. "If one day JUNGKOOK remembers the truth before we are ready to tell him, every member must deny it until the very end, even if that means he chooses to hate us forever." The sentence settled over the room like an unbearable weight. JUNGKOOK stood frozen. He repeated the words silently inside his mind, unable to understand why anyone who loved him would willingly choose to let him hate them. He slowly turned toward RM. "Did you really write that?" RM answered honestly. "Yes." "Would you really have lied to me forever?" RM closed his eyes before replying. "If I believed it would keep everyone alive, yes." JUNGKOOK instinctively stepped backward. It was the first time in years that he had physically moved away from the group instead of toward them. The small distance felt enormous. JIMIN noticed it immediately, and fear spread across his face. "JUNGKOOK," he whispered. JUNGKOOK raised one hand, silently asking him not to come any closer. "I need to understand." His voice trembled despite his efforts to stay calm. "All of you. Every birthday, every concert, every dinner, every time you smiled at me. Were you carrying this?" Nobody denied it. Jin answered quietly. "Every single day." J-Hope lowered his head. "We kept hoping there would be a right time." JUNGKOOK laughed bitterly. "And tonight was that right time?" No one replied. Taehyung finally broke the silence. "No." JUNGKOOK looked at him. "Then why now?" Taehyung looked toward Jimin before answering. "Because when Jimin kissed you tonight, I realized the promise had already been broken." Jimin slowly nodded. "I knew it would happen." Jimmy Fallon frowned. "What do you mean?" Jimin inhaled deeply. "The moment I kissed JUNGKOOK, I knew the secret couldn't survive anymore." Jimmy looked confused. "How are those things connected?" Jimin's eyes filled with regret. "Because the promise inside that letter was never about keeping a secret from the public." He looked directly at JUNGKOOK. "It was about keeping a promise from you." JUNGKOOK stared at him in disbelief. "Me?" Jimin nodded. "Everything I did after that night, including staying away from you when I wanted to be close, was part of that promise." The realization struck JUNGKOOK harder than anything else that evening. Years of distance, awkward conversations, unexplained arguments, moments when Jimin seemed ready to say something important before suddenly changing the subject. None of them had been accidents. They had all been sacrifices demanded by a decision JUNGKOOK had never been allowed to know existed. Suga slowly stepped forward, his movements weak but determined. Jimin wasn't the only one who paid that price. JUNGKOOK looked at him. Suga forced himself to continue. "Every time you asked me why he seemed different, I lied." His voice cracked. "Every time you worried he was pulling away, I told you he was just tired." He lowered his head. "I watched you blame yourself for something that wasn't your fault." JUNGKOOK felt a sharp ache in his chest. Those conversations came rushing back with painful clarity. Late nights in the studio, quiet car rides after schedules, casual questions that had seemed harmless at the time. He remembered asking Suga more than once if Jimin was angry with him. Suga had always smiled gently and reassured him that everything would be fine. Now Jungkook realized those reassuring words had hidden unimaginable guilt. Jimmy Fallon remained completely silent. The interview no longer belonged to television. It belonged to the 7 men standing before one another, trying to rebuild years of trust that had been buried beneath silence. Taehyung looked down at the final page once more. "There's still one thing none of you have told him." RM immediately lifted his head. "Taehyung." His voice carried unmistakable warning. Taehyung remained calm. "He deserves all of it." RM slowly shook his head. "Not like this." Taehyung's expression softened, but his resolve did not. "There will never be an easy way." He carefully turned the final page over, revealing something that no one except the members had seen in years. It wasn't another paragraph or another rule. It was a faded signature written beneath the final sentence, a signature that instantly drained every remaining color from Jungkook's face because he recognized the handwriting the moment he saw it. It wasn't RM's, it wasn't Jimin's, it wasn't Taehyung's, it was Suga's.
The moment Jungkook recognized Suga's signature at the bottom of the page, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. He stared at the faded ink, hoping his eyes had betrayed him, hoping exhaustion and emotion had blurred the handwriting into something familiar by accident. But the longer he looked, the more certain he became. It was undeniably Suga's signature, the same careful strokes he had seen countless times on lyric sheets, handwritten notes, and gifts exchanged over the years. His chest tightened. Slowly, almost mechanically, he lifted his eyes toward Suga. "You signed it?" he asked in a voice so quiet that everyone leaned forward to hear. Suga never tried to deny it. He simply nodded once. "I did." Jungkook blinked several times, struggling to understand. Then, "You agreed with all of this?" Suga inhaled deeply, but before he could answer, Taehyung quietly folded the letter and lowered it to his side. "No," Taehyung said. "That's the part none of us have explained." Jungkook frowned. "Then explain it." Taehyung looked toward Suga, silently asking for permission. For several long seconds, Suga remained completely still. Finally, he gave a weak nod. Taehyung turned back to Jungkook. Suga wasn't the last person to sign the letter. Jungkook looked confused. "What do you mean?" RM slowly stepped forward, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had relived the same memory thousands of times. "He was the first." Jungkook stared at RM. "The first?" RM nodded. "The moment the letter was finished, none of us wanted to sign it." Jin quietly continued the story. "We argued for hours." J-Hope added. "Nobody believed silence was the right answer." Taehyung looked down at the folded envelope. But Suga kept saying the same sentence over and over. Suga closed his eyes. He remembered every second, every word, every impossible decision. Jungkook looked at him. "What did you say?" Suga answered without hesitation, as though the sentence had never stopped echoing inside his mind. "If someone has to carry the blame, let it be me." The confession hit Jungkook harder than any revelation that had come before. He looked around at the others, searching for contradiction, but every member quietly lowered his head. It was true. RM continued. He believed that if his signature came first, the rest of us wouldn't have to feel responsible. Suga laughed softly through exhausted tears. "I was wrong." Jin gently placed a hand on Suga's shoulder. "You carried everyone's guilt instead." Suga nodded. "I know." Jimin slowly stepped closer, his voice breaking. "And I let you." Suga immediately looked at him. "No." "Yes." Jimin's eyes filled with tears for the first time that night. "Every time you apologized, I accepted it." His breathing became uneven. "Every time you blamed yourself, I stayed silent, because I thought that was what the promise demanded." He lowered his head in shame. "I watched you become smaller every year." Taehyung quietly looked away. Even he had never heard Jimin admit it so openly. Jimmy Fallon remained speechless. The story had grown far beyond anything he had imagined. This was no longer about one shocking kiss or one hidden confession. It was about years of invisible sacrifice inside a family that had convinced itself suffering in silence was the same as protecting one another. JUNGKOOK slowly walked toward Suga until they stood face to face. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, JUNGKOOK asked the one question that had been growing inside him since the signature was revealed. "If you believed everything was your fault," he paused, "why did you keep smiling at me?" Suga's lips trembled. A tear rolled slowly down his cheek before he answered. "Because every time you smiled back," he swallowed hard. "I convinced myself the lie was worth it." JUNGKOOK's expression collapsed. Years of ordinary memories suddenly transformed into something heartbreaking. Birthdays, recording sessions, award shows. Quiet meals after exhausting schedules. Every gentle smile Suga had given him had been hiding unbearable pain. JUNGKOOK reached out instinctively and took Suga's trembling hands. "Hyung," he whispered. Suga immediately looked away. "Don't." JUNGKOOK tightened his grip slightly. "Look at me." Reluctantly, Suga did. JUNGKOOK's eyes were filled not with anger, but with grief. "You spent years protecting me from something I never asked to be protected from." Suga nodded weakly. "I know. And you let yourself suffer alone." Another silent nod. JUNGKOOK's voice cracked. "Why didn't you trust me enough to carry the truth with you?" Suga closed his eyes, unable to answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were almost too quiet to hear. "Because I was afraid." He took another shaky breath. "If you knew what really happened that night," his voice broke completely, "you would never forgive yourself." JUNGKOOK froze. Those words changed everything. Until now, he had believed the secret existed to protect him from pain. But Suga's answer revealed something entirely different. They hadn't been afraid that JUNGKOOK would hate them. They had been terrified that JUNGKOOK would end up blaming himself, just as Suga had done for years. RM slowly looked toward Taehyung. Taehyung understood immediately. They had reached the edge of the secret. Only one truth remained untold. The truth behind the rainy night itself. The truth none of them had dared describe. Taehyung carefully picked up the old envelope once more, and slowly reached inside. This time he did not remove another letter. Instead, he pulled out a small, badly damaged photograph with a cracked corner and faded colors, preserved inside a transparent sleeve. The moment the photograph appeared, every member's expression changed. JIMIN covered his mouth. Jin stepped back in disbelief. J-Hope whispered, "I thought we destroyed that." RM's face turned completely pale. Suga's knees almost gave way beneath him. JUNGKOOK stared at the old photograph without recognizing it. But something deep inside him stirred the instant he saw it, as though a forgotten memory had begun clawing its way back to the surface. Taehyung held the photograph tightly, looked directly into JUNGKOOK's eyes, and quietly said, "This picture was taken only minutes before the night you forgot, and once you see what's inside it, you'll finally understand why every one of us agreed to sacrifice the truth." Taehyung held the faded photograph carefully between his fingers, refusing to turn it around immediately. The transparent sleeve reflected the bright studio lights, hiding the image from everyone except him. The longer he hesitated, the heavier the silence became. JUNGKOOK's eyes never left the photograph. Something about it felt strangely familiar, not because he remembered seeing it, but because his instincts told him it belonged to a memory that had been locked away for years. Jimmy Fallon remained completely still behind his desk. The audience no longer felt like spectators at a television show. They were witnesses to a story that had slowly transformed into a confession none of the people on stage had ever intended to make in public. RM took one cautious step toward Taehyung. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Taehyung looked at him with tired eyes. "We crossed that line a long time ago." RM lowered his head. He knew Taehyung was right. The kiss, the letter, the rules, and Suga's signature had already shattered the wall protecting the past. There was no reason to hide the photograph anymore. Jimin's breathing became uneven. "Please," he whispered. "Not the picture." Taehyung turned toward him. "You know why I kept it." Jimin slowly nodded. "Yes. Then you also know why I'm showing it now." Jimin closed his eyes. He could no longer argue. Suga quietly looked at the floor, unable to bear what was about to happen. JUNGKOOK noticed every reaction. None of them were pretending anymore. None of them were protecting themselves. They were protecting him. That realization somehow frightened him more than anything else. "Show me," Jungkook said calmly. Taehyung exhaled slowly. Without another word, he turned the photograph around. Jungkook reached for it instinctively, his fingers trembling as Taehyung carefully placed it into his hands. The photograph was old and slightly faded from age. It showed the 7 members standing outside the practice building on a rainy evening. Everyone was smiling at the camera. RM stood in the middle. Jin and J-Hope laughed naturally. Taehyung had one hand resting on Suga's shoulder. JIMIN stood beside Jungkook. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary group photo, the kind they had taken hundreds of times throughout the years. Jungkook looked up, confused. "I don't understand." Taehyung remained silent. "Look closer," he said. Jungkook lowered his eyes to the photograph again. This time he examined every face more carefully. The smiles looked genuine. The rain had just begun falling. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Then his eyes stopped near the bottom corner of the picture. There, barely visible behind the group, reflected in the glass entrance of the building, stood the faint outline of another person. The reflection was blurry, almost impossible to notice unless someone pointed it out. Jungkook frowned. "Who's that?" Nobody answered. Jimmy Fallon leaned forward, trying to see the reflection from where he sat. Even the audience strained their eyes toward the giant monitor that now displayed the photograph. The mysterious figure remained impossible to identify clearly, but one detail stood out immediately. The person was reaching toward the group with one arm extended, as though trying desperately to get someone's attention before the picture had been taken. Jungkook looked back at Taehyung. "Who is it?" Taehyung slowly shook his head. "That's the problem." Jungkook blinked. "What do you mean?" Taehyung's expression grew darker. "None of us remembers." The answer stunned everyone. Jimmy Fallon frowned. "How can nobody remember someone standing right behind you?" RM answered quietly. "Because none of us noticed the reflection until days later." Jungkook looked back at the picture. The mysterious silhouette suddenly felt far more unsettling than before. "So you never found out?" RM hesitated. "We thought we had." Jimin immediately looked toward RM. "Don't." RM sighed deeply. "He deserves to know." Suga slowly covered his face again. "No." RM continued anyway. "The night after this photograph was taken, we believed the reflection belonged to someone following us." Jungkook felt another wave of confusion. "Following us?" Taehyung nodded. "At first, we thought it was only a stranger." Jin quietly added, "Then strange things started happening." J-Hope looked down as old memories resurfaced. Phones rang with nobody answering. RM continued. "Messages disappeared." Taehyung added. "People claimed conversations had happened that none of us remembered." Jimmy Fallon looked completely absorbed. "You're saying everything changed after this picture?" RM nodded slowly. "Not immediately." His eyes met Jungkook's. "But this was the last normal photograph we ever took before that night." Jungkook stared at the image again. Suddenly the smiling faces no longer looked happy. They looked unaware, innocent, completely unprepared for whatever was waiting just beyond that rainy evening. As he continued staring at the mysterious reflection, a sharp pain suddenly pulsed through his head. He instinctively grabbed his temple. Jimin reacted immediately. "Jungkook!" Jungkook staggered one step backward, unable to explain what he was feeling. Another image flashed inside his mind. Rain hitting the pavement, someone shouting his name, a hand reaching toward him through the darkness, the sound of glass breaking, then a voice, clearer than all the others, whispering only 3 desperate words before everything disappeared into silence. "Don't turn around." Jungkook's eyes flew open. His breathing became rapid as he stared at the old photograph with growing horror. "I've heard that voice before," he whispered. Every member froze because they all knew exactly whose voice Jungkook had just remembered, and none of them had expected his memories to begin returning so soon. The instant Jungkook whispered that he had heard the voice before, every member reacted as though time itself had stopped. RM instinctively reached toward him but hesitated before making contact. Jin's breathing became shallow. J-Hope looked anxiously between Taehyung and Suga, silently asking what they should do next. Jimin's face turned completely pale while Suga seemed to lose all strength, gripping the edge of a nearby chair just to remain standing. Jimmy Fallon noticed that no one looked surprised by Jungkook's reaction. They looked terrified. "Whose voice?" Jimmy asked softly, careful not to interrupt the fragile moment. Jungkook kept staring at the faded photograph, his fingers tightening around its edges. The pounding inside his head grew stronger with every passing second. More fragmented images appeared without warning. Rain soaking the empty parking lot. Bright headlights reflecting off wet pavement. Someone running. A hand grabbing his sleeve. Another voice shouting from somewhere behind him. None of the memories stayed long enough to become clear. They flashed across his mind like broken pieces of a film that had been cut apart years ago. "I can't see the face," Jungkook whispered, "but I know that voice." Jimin took a cautious step forward. "Don't force yourself." Jungkook slowly looked at him. "You already knew this would happen, didn't you?" Jimin couldn't answer immediately. The guilt in his eyes spoke before his voice ever could. "I hoped it never would." Jungkook lowered his gaze again. "But you expected it." Jimin nodded once. "Yes." The admission made the silence even heavier. Taehyung quietly folded his arms, his anger replaced by quiet sadness. "That's why the rules were written," he said. "Not because we believed memories never returned." He looked directly at Jungkook. "Because we knew they eventually would," RM slowly continued. "The question was never if." He paused. "Only when." Jungkook closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. Another fragment surfaced. He remembered standing outside the practice building while rain poured from the dark sky. Jimin was arguing with someone just beyond the entrance. Taehyung kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. Suga repeatedly checked his phone. RM spoke urgently to Jin and J-Hope. The memory vanished before Jungkook could understand why everyone looked so frightened. He suddenly opened his eyes again. Someone was there. Nobody answered. Someone else was with us. RM remained silent. Taehyung lowered his head. Jimin slowly clenched his fists. Jungkook looked around the stage. "Tell me I'm wrong." Suga finally spoke. "You're not." Jungkook's heart pounded harder. "Then who was it?" Suga closed his eyes. "That's the one question we've never been able to answer." Jimmy Fallon frowned. "How is that possible?" RM answered carefully. "Because every one of us remembers that night differently." Jimmy blinked. "Differently?" RM nodded. "We've compared our memories hundreds of times." Jin quietly continued. "None of them match perfectly," J-Hope added. "The beginning is the same." Taehyung looked toward Jungkook. "The ending is the same." RM finished the thought. "Everything in between changes depending on who tells it." Jungkook stared at them in disbelief. "You're saying all 7 of you remember different versions of the same night?" RM answered honestly. 6? Jungkook frowned. 6? RM slowly looked at him. "Because you don't remember it at all." Those words echoed across the silent studio. Jungkook suddenly realized something he had never questioned before. Everyone had always described that rainy evening differently. Small details had never matched. One member remembered leaving the building first. Another insisted they had all walked out together. Jin once mentioned hearing thunder before the argument began, while J-Hope had always insisted it never rained until later. At the time, Jungkook had dismissed those inconsistencies as ordinary mistakes. Now they felt deeply unsettling. "We thought memory was playing tricks on us," Taehyung admitted. "Until we found something else." Jungkook immediately looked up. "What?" Taehyung reached back into the envelope again. This time he removed a small folded receipt, faded almost beyond recognition. Jimmy Fallon looked confused. "A receipt?" Taehyung nodded. It was inside the envelope with the photograph. He carefully unfolded the fragile paper and handed it to Jungkook. Jungkook looked down. It was an ordinary convenience store receipt dated the same night as the photograph. At first it seemed completely meaningless. Bottled water, coffee, snacks, umbrellas, nothing unusual. Then his eyes stopped near the bottom. The receipt listed 8 bottled drinks. Jungkook frowned. "There were only 7 of us." No one answered. He counted again. 8. He slowly lifted his head. "Who bought the 8th drink?" Silence. RM looked away. Jin swallowed hard. J-Hope rubbed the back of his neck nervously. Jimin's hands began trembling again. Suga quietly whispered, "That's the question that destroyed us." Jungkook looked back at the receipt. He counted one more time, hoping he had made a mistake. He hadn't. There were 8 drinks, 8 paper cups, and 8 straws listed on the receipt. Yet every official schedule, every photograph, every memory, and every public record from that day showed only 7 people together. Jimmy Fallon spoke carefully. Could it have been for someone outside the group? Taehyung slowly shook his head. That's what we believed at first. His eyes met Jungkook's. Until we enlarged the security footage from the convenience store, Jungkook's pulse quickened. What did you see? Taehyung answered in little more than a whisper. We saw all 7 members, standing in line. He paused. And someone standing between you and JIMIN, someone whose face never appeared clearly on the recording, but who was carrying the 8th drink.
Jungkook felt the receipt growing heavier in his hands, as though the thin piece of paper carried years of unanswered questions. 8 drinks, 8 paper cups, 8 straws. The numbers refused to change no matter how many times he counted them. He looked toward the members again, hoping someone would finally laugh and explain that it had all been a simple mistake at the convenience store. Instead, he found 7 faces trapped between fear and regret. Jimmy Fallon slowly stood from behind his desk, unable to remain seated any longer. The audience had become so quiet that the soft rustle of the old receipt sounded unusually loud inside the studio. You actually saw someone on the security footage? Jimmy asked carefully. Taehyung nodded. For less than 2 seconds. Could you recognize the person? Jimmy continued. Taehyung slowly shook his head. No, RM quietly added. The image became distorted every time we paused it. Jimmy frowned. Distorted? RM nodded again. The faces of all 7 members stayed perfectly clear. He paused before continuing. Only the 8th person blurred. Jungkook stared at RM, trying to understand whether this was really happening or whether years of silence had twisted everyone's memories into something impossible. Did anyone else see the footage? He asked. RM answered immediately. Only us. Where is it now? Taehyung looked toward Suga instead of answering. Suga remained silent for several seconds before finally whispering. Gone. Jungkook frowned. Gone. Suga nodded weakly. The next day, the file no longer existed. Jimmy Fallon looked completely puzzled. Deleted. RM slowly inhaled. We thought so. Jin quietly continued. The store manager insisted the recording had become corrupted. J-Hope looked down at the floor. Every backup had the same problem. Jungkook felt another sharp pulse inside his head. Corrupted footage. Different memories. 8 drinks instead of 7. A blurred reflection in the photograph. The pieces refused to fit together, yet all of them pointed toward the same missing answer. Did anyone outside the group know about this? Jungkook asked. RM slowly shook his head. No. Taehyung corrected him almost immediately. One person did. Every member looked toward Taehyung. Even Suga seemed surprised. RM's expression hardened. Don't. Taehyung remained calm. He deserves to know. JIMIN immediately looked up. Taehyung. Taehyung continued anyway. Someone else saw the photograph before we hit it. Jimmy Fallon leaned forward. Who? Taehyung looked directly at Jungkook. Our manager at the time. The stage became silent again. Jungkook searched his memory, trying to remember that period of their lives. Their longtime manager had always been calm, practical, and protective. He had been there during countless important moments. What did he say? Jungkook asked quietly. Taehyung answered without hesitation. He told us to burn the photograph. Jungkook blinked. Burn it? Taehyung nodded. Immediately. Jimmy frowned. Why? Taehyung looked down at the faded picture still resting in Jungkook's hands. Because after looking at it for almost a full minute, he paused. He asked us the same question none of us could answer. Jungkook felt his heartbeat quicken again. What question? Taehyung's voice dropped almost to a whisper. If there were only 7 of you that night, then who is standing in the middle of the group? Jungkook instinctively looked back at the photograph. At first he only saw the familiar 7 faces smiling into the camera. Then, without realizing why, his eyes shifted toward the space between himself and JIMIN. His breathing suddenly stopped. There was enough room for someone to stand there. Too much room. The gap between him and JIMIN looked strangely unnatural, almost as if the two of them had unconsciously left space for another person. He slowly measured the distance with his eyes. RM and Jin stood shoulder to shoulder. Jin and J-Hope stood close together. Taehyung rested naturally against Suga. But between Jimin and Jungkook, there was an unusually wide opening that nobody had noticed before. Jungkook felt his fingers begin to tremble. "Why?" he whispered. "Why is there so much space here?" Nobody answered. Jimin quietly turned away. Suga covered his eyes again. RM looked at the floor. Taehyung finally spoke. "Because when the picture was taken," he stopped, struggling to finish the sentence. Jungkook looked directly at him. "Say it." Taehyung closed his eyes for only a moment, before opening them again. "Every one of us remembered someone standing between you and Jimin." Jimmy Fallon stared in disbelief. "Then who was it?" Taehyung slowly shook his head. The next morning, none of us could remember the face. Jungkook felt another violent flash explode inside his mind. This time the memory lasted longer. Rain, laughter, a convenience store door opening, someone handing him a warm paper cup of coffee, a familiar voice saying, "Careful, it's still hot." Jungkook instinctively reached out as though trying to hold on to the disappearing memory, but the face remained completely blank. It was as if someone had erased only that one person, while leaving every other detail untouched. He staggered backward, breathing heavily. Jimin rushed forward instinctively, but Jungkook lifted one hand, asking him to stop. "I remember the voice," Jungkook whispered shakily. "I remember the coffee." His eyes widened with fear. "I even remember smiling back." He looked at every member one by one. "So why can't I remember who I was smiling at?" No one had an answer. The silence itself became terrifying. Then Suga slowly lifted his head, tears filling his eyes once more, and quietly said the words he had spent years refusing to speak aloud. "Because," he struggled to breathe, "the person you were smiling at was the last person any of us ever remembered losing." Suga's words settled over the studio with a crushing weight that no one could escape. Jungkook stood motionless, his mind refusing to accept what he had just heard. The last person any of them ever remembered losing. The sentence sounded impossible. If they had lost someone that important, how could no one remember a face, a name, or even a single clear conversation? Jimmy Fallon looked from one member to another, hoping someone would immediately explain what Suga meant. No one did. Every member wore the same haunted expression, as though they had all reached the edge of a memory they had spent years trying not to revisit. Jungkook slowly lowered his eyes to the faded photograph once again. The empty space between himself and Jimin no longer looked accidental. It looked intentional, as if everyone in the picture had unconsciously left room for someone they believed would always be standing there. His breathing became uneven. "You're telling me," he whispered, "there was someone so important to all of us, and now none of us even knows who that person was." RM answered first, his voice barely audible. "We remember the feeling." Jungkook looked up. RM continued. "We remember caring." Jin quietly added. "We remember laughing together." J-Hope swallowed hard. "We remember promising we'd never leave anyone behind." Taehyung finished the thought. "But every time we try to remember the face, everything goes blank." Jimmy Fallon frowned deeply. "Did you ever try writing down what you remembered?" RM nodded immediately. For months, Jungkook turned toward him. "What happened?" RM looked exhausted, simply recalling it. Every note contradicted the others. Jin continued quietly. "One notebook described a tall person," J-Hope added. "Another described someone shorter than Jimin." Taehyung shook his head. "One page said the voice was deep." Suga looked at the floor. Another said it was soft. Jimin slowly whispered, "The only thing every notebook agreed on," everyone looked at him, was that someone had disappeared. Jungkook felt another wave of pressure building inside his head. He tried desperately to picture the missing person, but every attempt ended the same way. A blank silhouette, a smile without a face, a voice without an identity. He clenched his fists, frustrated by the emptiness where a memory should have been. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice trembling. "People don't just forget someone completely," RM quietly replied. "We used to believe that too." Jimmy Fallon remained silent, allowing the story to unfold naturally. Even the audience seemed afraid to breathe too loudly. Taehyung carefully reached into the envelope one final time. This time he removed a small folded sheet of lined paper, older than everything else inside. Unlike the formal letter of rules, this page was filled with hurried handwriting from different people. Jungkook immediately noticed that each paragraph used a different pen. "What's that?" he asked. Taehyung looked at the paper with visible sadness. The last thing we all wrote together before we sealed the envelope. JUNGKOOK frowned. What does it say? Taehyung slowly unfolded it. The page was covered with short handwritten sentences. RM had written one. Jin had written another. J-Hope, Taehyung, Jimin, and Suga had all added something in different handwriting. At the very bottom, there was an empty space with no signature. JUNGKOOK pointed toward it. Why is the last space blank? No one answered immediately. Finally, Suga whispered, because it was supposed to be yours. JUNGKOOK looked at him in confusion. Mine? Suga nodded weakly. You were supposed to sign it after you woke up the next morning. JUNGKOOK's pulse quickened. Why didn't I? Jimin slowly closed his eyes. Because when you woke up, he paused, struggling to continue. You couldn't remember why the paper existed. JUNGKOOK stared at the blank space. His own missing signature somehow felt more unsettling than every other clue they had uncovered. It was proof that whatever had happened that rainy night had interrupted something all 7 of them had expected to finish together. Taehyung looked down at the handwritten messages. Read the last sentence RM wrote. JUNGKOOK carefully lowered his eyes to the page. The handwriting was unmistakably RM's. Slowly, he read the final line aloud. If one day we remember the truth, promise we will face it together, no matter how painful it becomes. JUNGKOOK stopped reading. A strange ache spread across his chest. He looked toward RM. You expected the memories to come back. RM nodded. Eventually. Then why hide everything? JUNGKOOK asked. RM answered with heartbreaking honesty. Because we were afraid only one of us would remember first. JUNGKOOK froze. One of us. RM looked directly into his eyes. If memories returned at different times, the first person to remember would have to carry the entire burden alone until the others caught up. Suga quietly smiled through fresh tears. That's exactly what happened. JUNGKOOK slowly turned toward him. Suga nodded once. I remembered first. The confession stunned everyone. Even Taehyung looked at Suga in silence. Not everything, Suga continued. Just enough to know something terrible had happened. His breathing became uneven again. Every year another small piece came back. He looked at JUNGKOOK with overwhelming sadness. And every new memory made me more afraid of the day yours would return. JUNGKOOK felt the room spinning around him. Every revelation led to an even deeper mystery. The missing person, the impossible photograph. The 8th drink, the contradictory memories, the sealed letter, the blank signature, and now Suga, admitting he had been living with fragments of the truth alone for years. Before JUNGKOOK could speak, another violent flash tore through his mind. This one was clearer than any before. Rain poured across the parking lot. Someone was laughing beside him. He could hear footsteps splashing through shallow puddles. Then the same familiar voice spoke again, this time much closer than before. If anything happens tonight, promise me you'll never blame yourself. JUNGKOOK's eyes flew open. His heart pounded violently as he realized something had changed. For the first time, he could remember not only the voice, but the exact words. He looked toward Suga in complete shock and whispered, I'm starting to remember what happened before the rain stopped.
JUNGKOOK's quiet confession instantly changed the atmosphere inside the studio. Until that moment, everyone had been chasing fragments of a forgotten past, but now the past was beginning to move toward them instead. Suga's face lost what little color remained. RM instinctively took one step forward before stopping himself. Jin looked at JUNGKOOK with visible concern, while J-Hope quietly whispered, It's happening. Taehyung never looked away from JUNGKOOK's eyes, searching for any sign that another memory was about to surface. JIMIN stood completely frozen. More than anyone else, he understood what the return of those memories could mean. Fallon remained silent, sensing that even a single unnecessary question might interrupt whatever JUNGKOOK's mind was struggling to recover. JUNGKOOK pressed one hand against his temple as another dull ache spread through his head. The studio lights seemed brighter than before. The voices around him became distant. He could still hear everyone breathing, but another sound slowly pushed everything else aside. Rain. The steady rhythm of rain striking the pavement filled his ears again. His heartbeat quickened. He closed his eyes. Without warning, another piece of the forgotten night unfolded. He saw himself standing beneath the small awning outside the convenience store, holding a warm paper cup between both hands. Jimin stood beside him, laughing quietly about something he could no longer remember. RM and Jin were carrying shopping bags toward the van. J-Hope struggled to keep an umbrella from turning inside out as the wind grew stronger. Taehyung kept glancing toward the dark street instead of joining the conversation. Suga stood near the entrance, looking unusually nervous while checking his phone again and again. Everything felt ordinary, peaceful, safe. Then someone spoke from just outside the edge of the memory. "You're all going the wrong way." Jungkook's breathing stopped. The voice was calm, familiar, gentle, yet the face remained hidden behind a blur that refused to clear. He instinctively took one step toward the invisible figure inside the memory. "Who are you?" he whispered. The memory immediately shattered. Jungkook opened his eyes with a gasp, returning to the studio. Sweat covered his forehead despite the cool air. JIMIN immediately moved closer. Jungkook looked directly at him. "I heard the voice again." JIMIN swallowed hard. "What did it say?" Jungkook repeated the sentence exactly as he had heard it. "You're all going the wrong way." Silence spread across the stage. Every member reacted differently. RM slowly lowered his head. Jin quietly shut his eyes. J-Hope covered his mouth. Taehyung's expression became more serious than before, but Suga's reaction was different. His entire body trembled. Jungkook noticed it immediately. "Hyung," Suga stared into the distance as though hearing the same words inside his own mind. "I remember that sentence," he whispered. Everyone looked at him. "I've remembered it for years." Taehyung frowned. "Why didn't you tell us?" Suga laughed bitterly. "Because I thought I imagined it." RM looked shocked. "You never wrote it in the notebooks." Suga slowly nodded. "I crossed it out every time." Jungkook frowned. "Why?" Suga answered honestly. "Because it didn't match anyone else's memories." The room became silent once more. For years they had compared notes, believing every contradiction was a mistake. Now they were discovering that some memories had been deliberately hidden out of fear that they were too strange to be real. Taehyung quietly looked toward RM. "Maybe that's why we never solved it." RM understood immediately. They had trusted only the details that matched, while ignoring every memory that stood alone. Jungkook slowly turned back toward Suga. "What else did you remember but never told us?" Suga hesitated. His breathing became uneven again. "Only fragments. Tell me." Suga closed his eyes. "I remembered someone telling me." He struggled to continue. "Whatever happens next, don't let Jungkook see it." Jungkook felt another sharp pain explode behind his eyes. The words struck something buried deep inside his memory. Another image flashed into existence. The rain had become heavier. Someone was pulling him backward by the sleeve of his jacket. He tried to turn around, but another hand covered his eyes for only a brief second. Then came the sound he had heard in every fragment since the beginning. Glass shattering somewhere nearby. A loud crash. Someone shouting in panic. The memory disappeared before he could see anything else. Jungkook instinctively grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. Fallon finally spoke, his voice calm and careful. "What did you see?" Jungkook looked at everyone, breathing heavily. "Not enough." He paused. "But someone was trying to stop me from looking at something." Taehyung immediately looked towards Suga. Suga nodded slowly. "That part matches what I remember." RM frowned. "Mine too." Jin looked surprised. "Me too." One by one, every member quietly admitted remembering the same thing, not the event itself, not the missing face, not the reason for the panic. Only one shared instinct remained perfectly clear in every version of the story. Someone had desperately tried to keep Jungkook from seeing whatever happened after the rain began. Jungkook slowly looked around at all 6 members standing before him. Their silence no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like fear. Years of fear. Years spent protecting him from a memory so painful that even they could barely speak about it without breaking apart. He looked back toward the old photograph still resting in his hands, then toward the folded letter, the faded receipt, and finally Suga's exhausted face. Every clue pointed toward the same unanswered moment hidden beyond the rain. Then, almost without realizing it, Jungkook quietly spoke another sentence that did not feel like his own thought but like something returning from the forgotten night itself. "Someone." He stopped, confused by the certainty in his own voice. "Made all of us promise never to tell me what happened after I turned around." The instant those words left his mouth, every member froze because not one of them had ever said that sentence aloud before. Yet somehow every one of them knew it was true. The sentence JUNGKOOK had spoken lingered in the air like an echo from another time. No one questioned it. No one asked how he could suddenly know something that none of them had ever admitted aloud. The shock on every face was enough to confirm that the memory had not been invented. It had returned. RM slowly sat down for the first time since the confrontation had begun, his hands clasped tightly together as if trying to steady himself. Jin remained beside him, unable to hide the concern in his eyes. J-Hope looked at JUNGKOOK with a mixture of relief and fear. Taehyung's expression softened, but only slightly. Suga looked completely overwhelmed, while JIMIN seemed unable to decide whether he should feel hopeful or terrified. Fallon quietly looked around the stage before speaking. "You're all reacting as though you've heard those words before." RM nodded slowly. "Not exactly the words." He looked toward JUNGKOOK. "The feeling." JUNGKOOK frowned. "What do you mean?" RM took a deep breath. "Every one of us remembered making a promise." He paused. "None of us remembered who asked us to make it." JUNGKOOK's heartbeat accelerated. "Until now," RM slowly nodded. "Until you said it." Taehyung looked directly at JUNGKOOK. "Your memory just connected something ours never could." JUNGKOOK lowered his head, trying to organize the fragments swirling inside his mind. He remembered rain, the convenience store, the warm coffee cup, the mysterious voice, someone pulling him backward, someone preventing him from turning around, and now, a promise. The memories still refused to form a complete picture, but they were no longer random. They were beginning to follow a sequence. Suga suddenly spoke, his voice shaking. "There's something I never told anyone." Every member looked toward him immediately. Even Taehyung seemed surprised. "Not even me?" Taehyung asked quietly. Suga slowly shook his head. "I was afraid if I said it out loud, it would become real." JIMIN instinctively stepped closer. "Hyung." Suga looked directly at JUNGKOOK. "The morning after that night," he stopped, swallowing hard before continuing. "I woke up holding something in my hand." JUNGKOOK frowned. "What was it?" Suga slowly reached into the pocket of his jacket. Everyone watched in complete silence. Carefully, he removed a thin silver keychain attached to a faded blue fabric strap. Time had worn away most of the printed letters, leaving only a few barely visible characters. JUNGKOOK stared at it, feeling an unexpected ache deep inside his chest. "I've seen that before," he whispered. Suga looked up in surprise. "You remember it?" JUNGKOOK frowned, struggling to focus. "Not clearly." He reached out cautiously, taking the keychain into his hand. The cold metal sent another wave of memories rushing toward him. He saw someone spinning the keychain around one finger while laughing. He heard the same familiar voice saying, "You'll lose this one day if you keep doing that." Then the image disappeared once again. JUNGKOOK closed his eyes tightly. "It's always the same," he whispered in frustration. The voice comes back, but the face disappears. Fallon remained completely silent, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Suga looked at the keychain with visible sadness. "When I found it that morning, I had no idea where it came from." RM quietly continued the story. "We searched every bag." Jin nodded. "Every pocket." J-Hope added, "Every room." Taehyung looked toward JUNGKOOK. "None of us recognized it." JUNGKOOK slowly opened his eyes again. "Then why did you keep it?" Suga smiled faintly. "Because even though I couldn't remember who it belonged to," he looked down at the faded strap, "I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." The studio became silent once more. JUNGKOOK carefully examined the worn fabric. Most of the lettering had disappeared, but one tiny section remained readable. Only a single handwritten initial had survived. The letter M. JUNGKOOK frowned. "M." RM immediately shook his head. "It isn't mine." Jin looked confused. "None of us has a keychain like that." Taehyung slowly narrowed his eyes. "Wait." Everyone turned toward him. "There used to be another blue strap." J-Hope looked surprised. "You remember that?" Taehyung nodded slowly. "Not clearly, but I remember thinking two of them looked almost identical." Suga's breathing suddenly became uneven again. "No," he whispered. RM looked at him. "What is it?" Suga slowly lifted his head, his expression filled with horror. "That's why I could never find the matching one." JUNGKOOK looked back at the keychain. "Matching?" Suga nodded weakly. "For years I kept thinking this keychain was supposed to have a pair." Every member fell silent. Jin quietly looked toward RM. J-Hope slowly backed away from the table. JIMIN covered his mouth again. Even Taehyung looked stunned by the realization. JUNGKOOK carefully turned the keychain over in his hand. On the back of the metal tag, hidden beneath years of scratches, he noticed something he had missed before. There was a tiny engraved date. It matched exactly the date printed on the convenience store receipt. The same rainy night that every one of them remembered differently. Before JUNGKOOK could say another word, another violent memory surged forward without warning. This time he saw two identical blue keychains hanging side by side. One was in his hand. The other belonged to someone standing directly in front of him. He couldn't see the person's face, but he clearly remembered the sound of both keychains gently tapping together as someone smiled and quietly said, "No matter what happens, if we ever get separated, we'll always know which one belongs to who." JUNGKOOK's eyes snapped open in shock. His hands began trembling uncontrollably as he stared at the single keychain resting in his palm, realizing with growing certainty that somewhere inside the forgotten night, there had once been two matching promises instead of one. JUNGKOOK continued staring at the blue keychain as though it might reveal the missing face if he looked at it long enough. The tiny engraved date on the back no longer felt like a random detail. It connected the photograph, the convenience store receipt, the mysterious voice, and the forgotten rainy night into a single thread. His hands trembled so noticeably that JIMIN instinctively reached toward him before stopping halfway, remembering how many times he had crossed invisible boundaries in the past without ever telling JUNGKOOK why. Fallon watched the scene unfold without speaking. Even the audience remained completely silent, sensing that another crucial piece of the story was about to surface. Suga slowly lowered himself into a chair, exhausted by memories he had spent years trying to suppress. RM stood beside him, offering quiet support, while Jin and J-Hope remained close enough to catch him if his strength failed again. Taehyung never took his eyes off JUNGKOOK. He had waited years for the truth to begin returning, yet now that it was happening, he wondered whether they had made the right decision by allowing the past to resurface. JUNGKOOK carefully rubbed the worn fabric strap between his fingers. The faded blue thread felt strangely familiar. Without warning, another memory slipped through the cracks. He remembered sitting on the floor of the practice room late at night. Music played softly from a speaker in the corner while everyone laughed after an exhausting rehearsal. Someone beside him held up two identical blue keychains and joked that if any of them ever became too famous to recognize one another, the matching keychains would solve the problem. The room had erupted in laughter. JUNGKOOK could hear it clearly. RM's deep laugh. Jin clapping his hands, J-Hope leaning backward until he almost fell over, Taehyung laughing so hard he covered his face, Suga smiling quietly instead of laughing loudly, JIMIN resting one arm across JUNGKOOK's shoulder, and somewhere among those familiar voices, another laugh, warm, bright, unmistakably present. JUNGKOOK suddenly opened his eyes. There was another laugh, he whispered. Every member froze. What kind of laugh? RM asked carefully. JUNGKOOK shook his head in frustration. I can hear it. He pressed both hands against his temples. I know that voice was laughing with us. His breathing became uneven, but every time I try to remember who it belongs to, he stopped as another sharp pain shot through his head. Everything disappears. Taehyung quietly looked towards Suga. Suga nodded almost imperceptibly. It was happening exactly as he had feared. The memories were returning in fragments, but the missing identity remained hidden. Fallon finally spoke after several minutes of silence. Could the missing person have been a friend outside the group? RM slowly answered. We asked ourselves that question hundreds of times. Jin quietly added, we searched old schedules. J-Hope continued, phone records. Taehyung looked toward the photograph. Guest lists. Suga closed his eyes. Even security logs. JUNGKOOK frowned. And RM answered honestly. Nothing. Jimmy looked confused. Nothing. RM nodded. Every official record insists there were only 7 people together that night. JUNGKOOK slowly looked down at the keychain again, but the receipt says 8. Taehyung answered immediately. Yes. JUNGKOOK lifted the photograph. The reflection shows another figure. Yes. JUNGKOOK pointed toward the empty space between himself and JIMIN. The group stood as though someone belonged there. Yes. JUNGKOOK looked directly at every member. Then the records are wrong. No one argued. Suga quietly whispered, "That's the conclusion we reached too." JIMIN suddenly spoke after remaining silent for so long. "There was one thing we never told anyone." Every eye turned toward him. JIMIN hesitated before continuing. 3 days after that night, we met again in the practice room." JUNGKOOK frowned. "I don't remember." JIMIN nodded sadly. "You wouldn't." He inhaled deeply. "We were trying to piece everything together." Taehyung looked surprised. JIMIN continued anyway. RM placed 7 chairs in a circle. RM immediately understood where the story was going. "Don't." JIMIN gently shook his head. "He deserves this part too." RM reluctantly remained silent. JIMIN looked back at JUNGKOOK. "We counted the chairs over and over." JUNGKOOK listened carefully. 7, JIMIN nodded. Then Suga quietly walked to the storage room. Suga lowered his head. "I remember," JIMIN continued. A few minutes later he returned carrying another chair. Fallon frowned. "An 8th chair," JIMIN nodded slowly. "He placed it between you and me." JUNGKOOK's breathing stopped. "Why?" Suga answered before JIMIN could. "Because." His voice trembled. "It felt wrong without it." Silence filled the studio once again. None of them had been able to explain why Suga had done it. He himself had never understood. He had simply felt an overwhelming certainty that someone always sat there. JUNGKOOK felt another violent surge of emotion. This time it wasn't a memory. It was grief, powerful, immediate, unexplainable. Tears suddenly formed in his eyes without warning. He quickly wiped them away, confused by his own reaction. "Why am I crying?" he whispered. Nobody answered. JIMIN slowly stepped closer despite his earlier hesitation. "Because." His own voice cracked. "I think your heart remembers before your mind does." JUNGKOOK looked toward him through tear-filled eyes. Before either of them could speak again, the old blue keychain suddenly slipped from JUNGKOOK's trembling fingers and landed on the studio floor. The tiny metal tag struck the stage with a clear metallic sound that echoed unnaturally through the silent room. Every member instinctively looked down. The impact had knocked loose something hidden inside the worn fabric strap. A tiny folded piece of paper, no larger than a fingernail, slowly slid out from the stitching where it had remained concealed for years. The tiny folded paper rested on the studio floor, so small that anyone could have mistaken it for a loose thread from the worn blue strap. Yet the moment it slipped free, every member reacted with unmistakable shock. Suga stood up so quickly that his chair scraped loudly across the stage. RM's eyes widened in disbelief. Jin instinctively covered his mouth. J-Hope whispered, "That's impossible." Taehyung stared at the tiny piece of paper without blinking, while JIMIN looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Fallon glanced from one face to another, realizing they were all seeing something none of them had expected to exist. JUNGKOOK slowly knelt and carefully picked up the tiny folded note between his fingertips. The paper felt incredibly fragile, as though one careless movement could cause it to crumble into dust. He looked toward the others. "Did any of you know this was inside?" Every member slowly shook his head. Suga's voice was barely audible. "I carried that keychain for years." He looked at the hidden note in disbelief. "I never knew." JUNGKOOK gently unfolded the paper one layer at a time. The handwriting inside had faded with age, but several words remained readable. Everyone instinctively moved closer without saying a single word. Fallon remained completely silent, allowing JUNGKOOK to read first. JUNGKOOK's eyes scanned the tiny message. His breathing gradually slowed, then suddenly stopped. "What is it?" RM asked quietly. JUNGKOOK looked up, confusion and emotion filling his face. "It isn't a letter," Taehyung frowned. "Then what is it?" JUNGKOOK looked back down at the tiny paper. "It's a reminder." Fallon stepped slightly closer. "What does it say?" JUNGKOOK swallowed hard before reading the faded words aloud. "If we forget, look for the stars before looking for the truth." Silence followed immediately. No one recognized the sentence. RM slowly frowned. "I've never heard that before." Jin quietly shook his head. "Neither have I." J-Hope looked at Taehyung. "Do you remember it?" Taehyung answered honestly. "No." Suga closed his eyes, desperately searching his memory. Nothing came. JIMIN quietly whispered the sentence to himself several times. It felt strangely familiar, yet he couldn't remember where he had heard it. JUNGKOOK carefully turned the tiny note over. There was one more line written on the back in even smaller handwriting. Most of it had faded beyond recognition, leaving only a few readable words. The stars, always remember. The rest had disappeared completely. JUNGKOOK stared at the incomplete message, frustrated that time had erased the ending. "What does that even mean?" he asked softly. Nobody answered. Then Taehyung suddenly looked toward the ceiling of the studio, his expression changing almost instantly. RM noticed it first. Taehyung. Taehyung didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly looked back toward JUNGKOOK. "The stars," he whispered. JUNGKOOK frowned. "What about them?" Taehyung inhaled sharply. "There was one place." Every member turned toward him. "One place we always went after difficult rehearsals." Jin's eyes widened. "The rooftop." Taehyung nodded slowly. "We called it." He stopped, struggling to remember. J-Hope suddenly finished the sentence without thinking. "Our place under the stars." The words escaped his mouth so naturally that even he looked stunned after saying them. RM immediately closed his eyes. Something had shifted inside his own memory as well. "Wait," he whispered. Suga looked at him. RM slowly rubbed his forehead. "I remember climbing those stairs." Jin nodded uncertainly. "Me too." JIMIN took one hesitant step forward. "I remember bringing coffee." JUNGKOOK's pulse quickened. Another memory flickered through his mind. He saw the rooftop beneath a clear night sky. 7 familiar silhouettes stood near the railing, laughing together. Then another shadow joined them from the far side of the roof. The figure remained blurred like every memory before, but this time something was different. Instead of hearing only one voice, JUNGKOOK heard everyone speaking together. "Promise?" someone asked. 7 voices answered at once. "Promise." Then an 8th voice quietly laughed. JUNGKOOK gasped and stumbled backward. The memory vanished before the face appeared, but one detail remained perfectly clear. There had been 8 voices on the rooftop, 8 promises, 8 people looking up at the same stars. "There were 8 of us," JUNGKOOK whispered before he could stop himself. No one argued, no one denied it. The certainty in his voice was stronger than any evidence they had collected. Suga slowly lowered his head as fresh tears rolled down his face. "I knew," he whispered. "I always knew something was missing." RM looked toward the old photograph, then toward the blue keychain, then finally toward the tiny note resting in JUNGKOOK's hand. Every clue now pointed to the same place. Not another object, not another letter, a location. Taehyung slowly spoke, his voice filled with quiet determination. "If the note says to look for the stars before looking for the truth." He paused. "Then the rooftop is where we have to begin." JIMIN looked at him with fear. "You think something is still there?" Taehyung answered without hesitation. "I think someone wanted us to find it only after our memories started returning." JUNGKOOK carefully folded the tiny note and held it tightly in his hand. For the first time that night, he no longer felt like they were wandering without direction. The clues were finally leading somewhere real. A photograph had pointed toward a missing space. A receipt had revealed an 8th drink. A keychain had uncovered a hidden message. Now the message itself was pointing toward the rooftop where they had once stood beneath the stars together. Before anyone could say another word, the studio lights flickered for only a brief second. The audience gasped softly. Every camera inside the studio froze for exactly 1 heartbeat before switching back on. At that same moment, one of the production assistants hurried nervously toward Jimmy Fallon and silently handed him a small note. Jimmy read it once, and the color immediately drained from his face. He slowly looked up at the members and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The security team just reviewed the live camera feed from backstage." He hesitated, unable to believe what he was reading. "They counted 8 people walking onto this stage tonight." Jimmy Fallon's voice barely carried across the silent studio, yet every person heard it with perfect clarity. The security team counted 8 people walking onto this stage tonight. No one reacted immediately. It was as if the sentence itself needed time to settle before anyone could believe it. JUNGKOOK slowly lowered the tiny folded note still resting in his hand. His heartbeat became louder than the distant murmur of the audience. RM stared at Jimmy without blinking. Jin instinctively looked toward the entrance backstage. J-Hope quietly turned in the same direction. Taehyung's expression hardened, while Jimin's breathing became noticeably uneven. Suga remained completely still, his face carrying the exhausted look of someone who had feared hearing those exact words for years. Jimmy looked down at the note from the security team once more, hoping he had misunderstood it. "They reviewed the recording twice," he said carefully. "The first count was dismissed as a mistake." Then another employee counted again. He paused before finishing. Both reports reached the same number. JUNGKOOK spoke almost automatically. 8, Jimmy nodded slowly. 8. The audience remained silent. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Whatever had begun as a shocking television interview had long since become something no one inside the studio could explain. RM slowly walked toward Jimmy and quietly held out his hand. "May I see the report?" Jimmy handed him the folded paper without hesitation. RM read every line carefully. His expression never changed, but when he finished, he quietly passed the note to Jin instead of saying anything. Jin read it, then silently handed it to J-Hope. One after another, every member read the same short report. Every reaction was identical: confusion, fear, recognition. Finally, the note reached Suga. His trembling hands unfolded it slowly. After reading only the first sentence, he closed his eyes and whispered, "The cameras." Taehyung immediately looked toward him. "What about them?" Suga swallowed hard. "The cameras counted someone," he struggled to continue. "The same way the receipt did." JUNGKOOK looked from Suga to the old photograph still lying on the table. 8 drinks, 8 voices, 8 people on the security report. The pattern was impossible to ignore. JIMIN quietly stepped toward Jimmy. "Can we see the footage?" Jimmy immediately turned toward one of the producers standing behind the cameras. The producer hesitated before nodding. A technician hurried toward the control room while the giant monitor above the stage switched from the live broadcast feed to the backstage security recording captured only minutes earlier. Everyone inside the studio instinctively looked upward. The black and white footage began playing. The members watched themselves entering the hallway behind the stage before the interview. RM walked first. Jin followed beside him. J-Hope laughed at something off camera. Taehyung adjusted his jacket. Suga walked quietly behind the others. JIMIN and JUNGKOOK entered last while talking to one another. JUNGKOOK counted automatically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The recording reached the end of the hallway. Jimmy looked confused. "I only see 7. The technician rewound the footage. "That's what we thought too," he answered nervously. He pressed another button. This time the software automatically highlighted every person detected by the security system. 7 familiar outlines appeared around the members. Then, for less than a second, another outline flashed between JIMIN and JUNGKOOK before disappearing again. The hallway immediately returned to showing only 7 people. Nobody spoke. The technician replayed the same moment in slow motion. Once again, the system briefly outlined an 8th figure walking naturally between JIMIN and JUNGKOOK. The figure never became fully visible. There was no clear face, no recognizable clothing, only a faint human-shaped outline acknowledged by the camera software before vanishing completely. Jimmy slowly stepped away from the monitor. "Is that a glitch?" The technician swallowed nervously. "We've checked the software 3 times. He looked toward Jimmy. "It only highlights human movement." RM quietly looked at JUNGKOOK. JUNGKOOK's breathing became uneven again. Another memory stirred inside him. He closed his eyes. The hallway on the monitor slowly transformed into another hallway from years earlier, the practice building. Rain tapping softly against the windows. 7 familiar footsteps echoed across the floor. Then another pair of footsteps matched their rhythm perfectly. Not behind them, not ahead of them, between JIMIN and JUNGKOOK. JUNGKOOK instinctively whispered, "Someone always walked there." His voice shook with certainty. JIMIN immediately looked at him. "You remember?" JUNGKOOK slowly nodded. "Not the face." He paused, "only where they stood." Taehyung lowered his head. "Between you and JIMIN." JUNGKOOK nodded again. Suga quietly covered his eyes. Tears escaped despite every attempt to stop them. "I remember moving over," he whispered, "to make room." Jin suddenly inhaled sharply. "So do I." J-Hope looked stunned. "I thought I imagined that." RM slowly rubbed his forehead. "Every group photo." He stopped speaking as another realization struck him. Taehyung immediately understood. "We always left the same space." RM nodded silently. JIMIN looked toward the old photograph lying on the table. Not because we planned it, his voice broke, because it felt natural. JUNGKOOK stared at the frozen security image on the monitor. The faint outline between himself and JIMIN remained visible for only a fraction of a second before fading away again. He took one slow step toward the screen. His reflection merged with the blurry outline until he could barely distinguish one from the other. Another fragment returned. The rooftop beneath a sky full of stars. 8 silhouettes standing together. Someone gently placing a hand on his shoulder. The familiar voice laughing quietly before saying, "No matter what happens. Don't forget where we made our promise." The memory vanished once more before the face appeared, but this time JUNGKOOK no longer felt only confusion. He felt certainty. The rooftop was no longer simply another clue. It was the place where every answer had begun, and somewhere beneath the same stars where 8 promises had once been made, the final truth was still waiting for all of them. The security footage remained frozen on the giant screen above the stage, the faint outline of an 8th figure barely visible between JIMIN and JUNGKOOK before fading into static. No one spoke for several long seconds. The silence felt different now. Earlier it had been filled with uncertainty. Now it carried anticipation. For the first time since the interview began, every clue pointed toward the same destination. JUNGKOOK slowly stepped away from the monitor, but his eyes never left the blurry outline. He no longer felt afraid of it. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sadness he couldn't explain. It was the kind of grief reserved for someone deeply loved, even if their name had been erased from memory. Fallon quietly folded the security report and placed it on the desk. "I've hosted this show for years," he said softly. "I've seen unbelievable moments, but I've never seen 7 people react to the same impossible thing with exactly the same heartbreak." RM looked toward Jimmy and answered honestly, "Because this isn't impossible to us anymore." Jimmy frowned slightly. RM continued, "We've been living with impossible things ever since that night." Jin nodded in quiet agreement. J-Hope looked at the stage floor, remembering all the years he had convinced himself those strange feelings would eventually disappear. Taehyung remained focused on JUNGKOOK, carefully watching every expression that crossed his face. Suga slowly wiped away the tears that refused to stop falling. JIMIN stood only a few steps away from JUNGKOOK, wanting to comfort him but still afraid that every word might make the burden even heavier. JUNGKOOK finally broke the silence. "I think I know why I never remembered the face." Every member immediately looked toward him. RM asked carefully, "Why?" JUNGKOOK closed his eyes. "Because every memory ends before I look directly at them." Taehyung frowned. "You're saying something always interrupts it." JUNGKOOK nodded slowly. "Every single time." He took a deep breath. "The rain, the crash, someone pulling me away, someone covering my eyes." He looked toward Suga. "Someone begging me not to turn around." Suga quietly nodded. "That's exactly how my memories stopped too." Jin looked surprised. "Mine as well." J-Hope slowly raised his hand. "Mine too." RM looked down in disbelief. "All of us," Taehyung answered quietly, "except none of us realized it before tonight." The realization spread through the group almost instantly. For years they had focused on what each person remembered differently. They had never noticed that every memory stopped at precisely the same moment. JIMIN slowly whispered, "We all lost the same ending." JUNGKOOK repeated the words softly. "The same ending." Fallon looked toward the members with growing curiosity. "If every memory stops at the same point," he paused before finishing the thought, "then maybe the truth begins exactly where your memories end." No one answered immediately because everyone understood the possibility at the same time. RM slowly nodded. "The rooftop." Taehyung looked toward the tiny folded note still resting beside the old keychain. "Look for the stars before looking for the truth." He repeated the sentence almost to himself. It wasn't a metaphor. JIMIN finally allowed himself to step beside JUNGKOOK. This time JUNGKOOK didn't move away. They stood silently next to each other while staring at the faded photograph lying on the table. JIMIN quietly smiled through exhausted eyes. "Do you know what hurts the most?" JUNGKOOK looked at him. JIMIN's voice trembled. Even after forgetting everything, he looked toward the empty space in the picture. "We still kept making room." JUNGKOOK lowered his gaze. He remembered every group photo over the years. Every casual gathering, every rehearsal picture. Somehow there had always been a small gap between himself and JIMIN. None of them had questioned it. None of them had noticed it. Yet now it felt impossible to ignore. Suga slowly stood and walked toward the photograph. His movements were slow but determined. He gently touched the faded image with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Nobody asked who he was speaking to. Somehow every person on the stage understood that the apology was meant for the missing place in the picture as much as it was meant for themselves. RM quietly placed one hand on Suga's shoulder. "You carried this long enough." Suga looked toward him with tired eyes. "Not long enough." RM shook his head. "Too long." Jin smiled sadly. "None of us should have carried it alone." J-Hope nodded. "Not anymore." Taehyung looked at every member one by one before finally stopping at JUNGKOOK. "When this interview ends," he said calmly, "we're going back." Jimmy Fallon frowned. "Back where?" Taehyung answered without hesitation. "The rooftop." JUNGKOOK looked toward the ceiling as though he could already see the night sky waiting beyond it. Another faint memory brushed against his mind. Cool air, city lights stretching across Seoul, 8 shadows standing beneath countless stars, someone quietly counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then a warm voice laughing before adding, "Don't forget 8. JUNGKOOK opened his eyes immediately. His heartbeat accelerated. The memory disappeared almost instantly, but one detail remained clearer than ever before. Someone had always been the one who counted. Someone had always reminded them that the number was never 7. JUNGKOOK slowly turned toward the others. "Whatever we find on that rooftop," he said quietly, "promise me one thing." Every member listened. "This time." He looked at RM, then Suga, then JIMIN, and finally Taehyung. "No more rules." RM's eyes filled with emotion as he nodded. "No more rules." Jin quietly repeated the promise. "No more silence." J-Hope smiled sadly. "No more pretending." Suga whispered through fresh tears. "No more carrying it alone." Jimin looked directly into JUNGKOOK's eyes. "No more running away." Taehyung took one slow breath before speaking the final promise. "And no matter what we remember under those stars." He looked toward the old photograph, the blue keychain, the faded receipt, the folded note, and the empty space that had silently followed them for years. "This time, all 7 of us will face the truth together. Even if it finally proves we were never only 7 to begin with." The applause that normally marked the end of a television interview never came. No one in the audience seemed willing to interrupt the fragile silence that had settled across the studio. Jimmy Fallon quietly removed the microphone clipped to his jacket and placed it on his desk without taking his eyes off the 7 members standing together under the bright stage lights. The interview had stopped feeling like entertainment long ago. It had become the beginning of a journey none of them could avoid any longer. JUNGKOOK stood in the center of the stage with the faded photograph in one hand and the blue keychain in the other. The tiny folded note rested safely inside his jacket pocket. Every clue they had uncovered pointed toward one destination, yet before they could leave, JUNGKOOK suddenly noticed something he had completely overlooked. He slowly looked around the stage. 7 chairs had been prepared for the members before the broadcast began. 1 for RM, 1 for Jin, 1 for Suga, 1 for J-Hope, 1 for Taehyung, 1 for Jimin, 1 for JUNGKOOK. But during the emotional confrontation, Suga had pulled an extra chair closer to the group without anyone paying attention. JUNGKOOK frowned. He counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. His heartbeat immediately quickened. "Hyung," he whispered. Suga looked toward him. JUNGKOOK pointed at the chairs. "When did that get here?" Every member turned simultaneously. Their expressions changed almost instantly. The 8th chair stood quietly between JUNGKOOK and Jimin, exactly where Suga had instinctively placed another chair years earlier in the practice room. Jimmy Fallon slowly looked toward one of the stage managers. "Was that chair always there?" The stage manager shook his head immediately. "No." Another crew member answered from the side of the stage. "I only brought out 7 before we started." RM slowly walked toward the chairs, carefully counting them one by one. He stopped in front of the last one. His breathing became noticeably heavier. "Nobody moved this here?" he asked. Every crew member shook their heads. The technician responsible for the set looked completely confused. "I never touched another chair." Taehyung quietly looked at Suga. "Did you?" Suga slowly shook his head. No, Jimin looked down at the empty seat, his eyes beginning to fill with tears once more. It's in the same place. JUNGKOOK whispered, between us. Nobody needed to ask what he meant. The empty chair occupied the exact space that had appeared in the faded photograph, the exact position highlighted by the security camera software, and the same place Suga had instinctively prepared years ago without understanding why. Fallon carefully approached the chair but stopped only a step away. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt strangely uncomfortable touching it. This is, he searched for the right word, unusual. RM quietly answered, no. Jimmy looked at him. RM's tired smile carried years of sorrow. For us, he looked toward the empty chair. It's familiar. JUNGKOOK slowly walked toward it. Every member instinctively reached out as though wanting to stop him, but none of them spoke. He stood in front of the chair for several seconds before carefully placing the faded photograph on the seat. The picture rested perfectly flat, with the empty space between himself and Jimin now directly above the empty chair beneath it. A strange feeling washed over him. Another memory surfaced. This one lasted longer than any before. He saw the rooftop beneath countless stars. The 7 members stood together, laughing quietly after a long rehearsal. Then someone carried an extra folding chair across the rooftop and placed it between JUNGKOOK and Jimin. Everyone laughed because there weren't enough chairs for all of them. The familiar voice joked, looks like nobody wants to sit next to JUNGKOOK tonight. JUNGKOOK remembered pretending to look offended while everyone laughed even harder. He remembered grabbing the extra chair before someone else could take it. He remembered saying, then I'll save this seat for you. His breathing stopped. The memory froze. He couldn't remember who had answered him. He couldn't remember the face, but he remembered waiting for someone to sit down beside him. JUNGKOOK suddenly opened his eyes. Tears rolled silently down his face. I remember the chair, he whispered. Jimin looked at him with trembling eyes. You do? JUNGKOOK nodded slowly. It wasn't empty. His voice cracked. I was saving it. Suga covered his mouth as another wave of emotion overwhelmed him. RM quietly turned away, unable to hide his own tears. Jin gently placed one hand on J-Hope's shoulder as both struggled to remain composed. Taehyung closed his eyes for a brief moment before speaking. Then we were right all along. JUNGKOOK looked toward him. Taehyung nodded toward the empty chair. We never forgot on purpose. He paused. Our hearts just kept saving the place, long after our memories disappeared. Even Fallon could no longer hide the emotion on his face. He quietly stepped back, giving the 7 members space. No cameras moved. No producers interrupted. No audience member spoke. For several long moments, everyone simply looked at the empty chair resting beneath the faded photograph. Then JUNGKOOK reached into his pocket and removed the tiny folded note once more. He carefully unfolded it and read the familiar words again. If we forget, look for the stars before looking for the truth. This time, however, something else caught his attention. Under the bright studio lights, faint impressions appeared beneath the faded ink, almost invisible until the paper was tilted at just the right angle. JUNGKOOK slowly turned the note toward the light. Hidden beneath the original handwriting, another sentence began to emerge, written in ink so faded it had remained invisible for years. JUNGKOOK's eyes widened as he slowly read the first words aloud. When the 8th seat, he stopped abruptly. The remaining letters were still too faint to read clearly, but everyone on the stage realized the tiny note contained another message they had never known existed. One that had remained hidden until the exact moment an 8th chair silently returned to its place between Jimin and JUNGKOOK. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the tiny note trembling in JUNGKOOK's hands. The newly revealed words, when the 8th seat, felt like they had been waiting years for this exact moment. No one dared interrupt. Even the audience seemed to understand that whatever came next would decide everything. JUNGKOOK carefully tilted the fragile paper beneath the bright studio lights again, trying to catch the faded ink from another angle. The hidden sentence became slightly clearer, but only a few more letters appeared before disappearing again. RM immediately called one of the production staff. Within seconds, a portable magnifying lamp was placed on the table. Fallon silently stepped aside, allowing the members to gather around it together. The light illuminated every crease in the ancient paper. JUNGKOOK slowly lowered the note beneath the lamp. One by one, more faded letters emerged from the page. Jin leaned forward, barely breathing. J-Hope instinctively reached for Taehyung's sleeve. Suga closed his eyes for only a moment before forcing himself to look. JIMIN stood shoulder to shoulder with JUNGKOOK, neither of them realizing they had unconsciously moved closer together. RM quietly whispered, "Read it." JUNGKOOK swallowed hard and slowly followed the hidden handwriting with his eyes. The complete sentence finally appeared. "When the 8th seat is no longer empty, come back to where we counted the stars." Silence, absolute silence. The words echoed through every heart inside the studio. Taehyung slowly lowered his head. "The rooftop," he whispered. RM nodded. "There can't be any doubt anymore." JIMIN quietly repeated the sentence to himself as though afraid it might disappear if he stopped saying it. "When the 8th seat is no longer empty." His voice cracked. "It waited for us." Suga looked at the empty chair resting between JUNGKOOK and JIMIN. For years he had instinctively made room for someone he could no longer remember. Tonight, without anyone asking him, that space had returned on its own. He smiled through tears. "Maybe," he whispered, "it was never empty." JUNGKOOK looked toward the chair again. Something inside him shifted. The grief remained, but the fear was slowly fading. He no longer felt as though he was chasing a ghost. He felt as though someone had been patiently waiting for all of them to remember a promise they had made together. Fallon quietly folded his hands. "I've spent the whole night asking questions," he said softly, "but I think I finally understand something." The members looked toward him. Jimmy smiled sadly. This story was never about discovering who was missing. He paused before continuing. It was about discovering why none of you ever stopped leaving a place for them. No one answered because there was nothing left to deny. Every photograph, every rehearsal, every gathering, every unconscious step, every empty space between JIMIN and JUNGKOOK had been a silent promise that survived even after memory failed. RM slowly looked around at every member. "We started tonight with rules." His eyes moved toward the torn letter lying on the table. Rules meant to keep the past buried. He then looked toward the hidden note, the faded photograph, the blue keychain, the old receipt, and finally the empty chair. "Now we have something stronger than rules." Jin quietly smiled for the first time that night. "A direction," J-Hope nodded. "A place." Taehyung looked toward JUNGKOOK. "And finally," his voice softened, "a reason." JUNGKOOK carefully folded the hidden note once again and slipped it into the same blue keychain strap where it had remained hidden for years. He gently closed his fingers around it, almost as if he were protecting someone's final message. Then he looked at every member one by one. RM, Jin, Suga, J-Hope, Taehyung, JIMIN. Their exhausted faces no longer reflected only fear. There was hope now, painful, uncertain hope, but hope nonetheless. Suga slowly walked toward JUNGKOOK and placed one trembling hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," he whispered. JUNGKOOK looked at him. Suga continued, "For every year I let you believe there was nothing missing." JUNGKOOK slowly shook his head. "You weren't protecting a secret." He smiled sadly. "You were protecting all of us until we were ready." Suga's tears returned, but this time they were no longer tears of unbearable guilt. They were tears of release. JIMIN quietly stepped beside JUNGKOOK. Without saying a word, JUNGKOOK reached out and squeezed JIMIN's hand for only a brief second before letting go again. No dramatic declaration was needed. Both of them understood what that simple gesture meant. Whatever truth waited beneath the stars, neither of them would face it alone again. Taehyung quietly picked up the faded photograph from the empty chair and carefully slid it back inside the old envelope together with the receipt and the original letter. RM placed the blue keychain on top before sealing everything once more. "This time," RM said firmly, "we're not sealing it to hide the truth." He handed the envelope to JUNGKOOK. "We're carrying it home." JUNGKOOK accepted it with both hands. The weight of the envelope felt different now. It no longer carried unanswered questions. It carried a promise waiting to be completed. Fallon walked with the members toward the edge of the stage as the audience finally rose to their feet, not with loud applause but with quiet respect. Nobody wanted to break the moment. As the 7 members reached the exit leading backstage, JUNGKOOK paused for one last glance at the stage behind him. His eyes stopped on the empty chair still standing alone beneath the lights. For the briefest moment, he could have sworn he heard the same warm laugh from every memory echo softly across the silent studio. He turned instinctively toward the sound, but the chair was empty once again. JUNGKOOK smiled through tears instead of fear. "We're coming back," he whispered. "This time. We'll remember everything." And somewhere beneath the same night sky that had witnessed 8 promises years before, the rooftop quietly waited for the footsteps that had finally found their way home. The next time the 7 members stand beneath the stars, they won't be searching for another clue. They'll uncover the one object hidden on that rooftop since the rainy night, and when JUNGKOOK finally opens it, one forgotten name will return, changing everything they believed about the 8th promise forever.